Hey, it's Emily, your favorite PodRocket producer. Did you know that LogRocket has a TikTok now? You can catch up on all the interview clips from this show, watch UX tutorials, and get more great content from LogRocket. You can check out the LogRocket TikTok today at log.rocket. See you on TikTok.
Hi, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. LogRocket provides AI-first session replay and analytics, which surface the UX and technical issues impacting user experiences. Start understanding where your users are struggling by trying it for free at logrocket.com. Hello, everyone. I am your host today, Paige Niedringhaus, and we have Mo Khazali, the head of mobile and a tech lead at Theodo UK, here to talk about Universal React. Welcome to the show, Mo.
Thanks for having me, Paige.
Well, let's just dive right in because this is a term that I'm not familiar with. So could you briefly introduce the concept of Universal React for our listeners and for myself?
Sure. I guess this concept of Universal React it's more of a novel concept that's been around, but the whole premise and the whole goal here is React and React Native are sort of ways where you define UI on different platforms. You use React on the web and it uses the DOM, and then you use React Native to target those native platforms, but still use that JSX syntax to define your UI, regardless of what platform you're targeting. And a lot of people within these two different ecosystems started to think, hey, what if we just used the same React code base that we have across web and mobile? And this whole concept of Universal React was created. The premise or the goal is, how can we maximize code sharing? Because UIs are UIs at the end of the day, while still trying to make sure that we don't fall into the pattern of cutting corners on these different platforms and not optimizing for the platform-specific intricacies. So I guess Universal React as an overall umbrella is, how can we maximize code share without reducing the quality and making sure that we still have native experiences on each of our platforms, web, mobile, iOS, and Android, or even beyond that into things like TV and desktop devices and so on and so forth.
Well, that is a lot to take in, but it makes sense because I think that's been the goal of React since it was created, was something that you could write once and run anywhere, whether it was mobile devices, tablets, websites. What challenges have you faced while navigating this kind of fragmented world of many different platforms? And how does Universal React try and address this in a way that may be unique from other platforms that have tried to do the same?
Let's take a trip down memory lane with this because it gets quite interesting. If you go back into like the late 90s, early 2000s, we were in the Java world. Java was like the promised sort of programming paradigm or language that would allow you to finally, build one application. It was really the origin of write once, run anywhere. And so people really jumped on the Java bandwagon and were like, okay, we're going to use this technology and it's going to work on everything. I've seen some books or some videos of Java from back in the day where they're showing all these different platforms. Java's running on planes, Java's running on phones, Java's running on TV, like anything you can imagine, there was like a Java logo plastered onto it. And it very quickly got a very bad reputation and it became once bug everywhere, which got a lot of people skeptical about cross-platform. And so, you had Java and it didn't really work out. You had Flash as well. A lot of people thought Flash was going to finally solve it. You've got this one language that can work and you can write ActionScript and it'll run everywhere. They tried to go into the mobile space and that wasn't a very good movement, and then Apple shut it down. And I guess when I look back at these, the thing that I see that is common between Java and Flash, and I think where they ultimately didn't really work very well, was that they really didn't try to respect the native layer implementations. They said, you know what, we're going to create our own runtimes and our own sort of engines that will run, and we'll replicate how the native feel kind of looks like on each of these platforms. But ultimately, they're going to all run in our own like JVM, or they're going to run in like a Flash player. And it just meant that people got these subpar experiences that they weren't happy about. And native was always a step further. And so when you go into the React world, yes, React is like just one layer that defines the UI, but ultimately you need to pair it with a renderer that's specific and implemented natively for each of the platforms. With React on the web, there's React, and then you add React DOM into it. But when you go into React Native, it's an interesting different paradigm, because when you've got a view in React Native, it translates to an Android view, a native Android view under the hood, and a native iOS view on the other side. And this different approach of saying, we're going to just be an abstraction. We're not going to try to create our own engine. We're not going to try to pretend to be native, but not really be native. What we're going to do is we're going to actually implement native functionality and native libraries and native views under the hood and native UI ultimately, while still giving people the option to abstract away so that they don't need to think about each of these different platforms. And so I think that's where the React Native and ultimately the React approach is a bit superior. And we've seen it. It's widespread now, and a lot of the best apps in the world are using React Native. It's like a production grade framework that's been tried and tested at its up and downs. It's reached a point where I think it's now proven that it works well. It can be performant if you know how to use it, and so on and so forth. And so I think this is where it's different. And so fragmentation is, there on web and mobile, but ultimately we're going into this era where things are getting even more fragmented. So you've got these like AR, VR devices that are coming out, a lot of these like AI first devices that are coming up that don't necessarily have like traditional UIs, but you got to support a lot of them. I've seen smart fridges, like Samsung's trying to bring Android to fridges, which is a whole other thing. Whether or not that's going to be a success is a different story, but like it's happening. And of course, like smart TVs, and you see all of these different smart TVs. And I've spent a bit of time in the TV ecosystem, and there are 19 operating systems in TV land when you're dealing with smart TVs, which is crazy, right? Like you think there's 2 operating systems on iOS and Android, and mobile developers struggle to keep in parity between these two. And then you've got 19 on the TV world. And so people are consuming UIs everywhere now. It's not just on phones and desktops. It's across like your home and your life and everywhere else, and in your car and so on and so forth. And so I think having a good cross-platform baseline and a good technology to be able to build good cross-platform apps is even more essential than it ever was back in the 90s, back in the 2000s and the 2010s. Today, you see it more and more as a necessity. And so I think that's where I think React Native, with the approach and the architecture that it has, is probably best suited to tackle that problem.
It sounds like it. I had no idea there were so many different TV interfaces, but that sounds completely exhausting to try and keep up with.
100%.
So I think you've kind of started to lead into the next question, which was how does Universal React kind of level the playing field for either smaller teams or for indie developers? And it sounds like it just makes it a lot easier.
100%, right? Because I like to go with an example for this one. If you've been keeping up with Blue Sky, which I'm sure you have been, Blue Sky is really taking on one of the biggest social medias out there, right? And trying to build a platform that's available from day one on iOS, Android, and web, and has those interfaces available. And the team that built it is less than a handful of people, and they built it with Universal React. And so they've built a universal application with React Native that targets web and mobile, and they've been able to pull it off and iterate and build at a fast pace, really just adding a whole load of features rapidly without having to build out these different teams. It's a front-end team of maybe 3 or 4 people, and they're really doing a phenomenal job. And I think because these teams, these smaller teams or these indie teams, don't have to spend their time really thinking about, okay, how do I build this in Swift, and how do I build this in Kotlin, and then how do I build it in, let's say, React or Angular or whatever web framework you choose to build it in, they can really spend time thinking about how they want to evolve the product more holistically. And so I think it opens up those doors for people to be able to really just focus on building a really good product, regardless of the technology that they're trying to target.
Yeah. So you need to be less of a, I guess, polyglot to be able to build something that can scale to lots and lots of people and lots of different devices in different ways.
100%. Yeah, exactly.
All right. So what are some of the misconceptions that you think people might have about Universal React after hearing something as good as this promise?
Let me take a step back and maybe talk about some of the building blocks of Universal React and how it works under the hood, or what the dev setup maybe looks like. And then that should start to paint a picture. So I guess the fundamental premise is that React Native is the agnostic way to define UIs with React. Because when you use React on the web, oftentimes you're dealing with DOM elements, you're dealing with H1 tags, P tags. These are web elements. These are DOM elements that are coming into React as part of React DOM. And we generically refer to it as React, but that's not really React. That's more React DOM that we're just colloquially referring to as React. React Native is a lot more agnostic to that. So it's like views and texts. These are just generic terms that we use. And then people, since I guess 2016, React Native Web and other libraries have been around. So you can take those views and texts and translate them to DOM components to use them on the web. And so with that building block, you can start to use React Native on the web with React Native for Web. And so Universal Apps is basically really React Native at its core, but it's using an architecture and an infrastructure and a bootstrapping in place to be able to basically handle things like your routing in a cross-platform way that works across web and mobile and potentially other platforms, to be able to use your styling and all of the other sort of toolkits and things that you need when you're building an app across the board. The misconceptions that I guess people usually have is either going and thinking that when you're building a universal React app, your mobile experience is a subpar sort of web view fake hybrid application. A lot of people still think React Native, even without the whole universal React promise, is really just a web view Ionic style sort of framework, which is really not. But people still have this perception. On the other side, there's this idea that people think, okay, if you're building an app in React Native and then you're targeting the web, surely it must behave like a mobile app. Like it might not even be responsive. It'll just be this like very thin mobile app that you can click on the browser and play around with. It's not quite that either. And so people think that it necessarily comes with a compromise one way or another. And what I've learned over the last couple of years of doing this sort of on a few different production applications and companies that we've worked with is that if you put the building blocks and the architecture in place, neither of those platforms need to struggle or suffer, let's say, or they don't need to be compromised. It is a challenge because you need to know how to architect those apps in a way where you're not compromising on quality on one or the other. But I think it is very much possible, and we've seen it with something like Blue Sky.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more. You've talked about React Native and how it's different in terms of the components and the styling from just generic React. The talk that you gave, you talk about the role of the fabric rendering layer in React Native. Could you talk a little bit more about this and how it differs from the web's rendering processes?
Over the last few years in the React Native ecosystem, there's been this new architecture effort. And so obviously React Native was released in, let's say, 2015 it was, yeah. In 2015, they built it with this old architecture and it had a rendering layer, which was relying on this bridge, which was this asynchronous mechanism to render views and text and stuff from JavaScript into the native world and into native views and texts. And there were some bottlenecks there, but one of the major things that ended up happening was that it acted quite differently to how React developers on the web are used to. And the example that I like to give here is the use layout effect hook that we use in the React world. So you call the use layout effect hook, and you know that it will render after that render cycle is done. Use layout effect, it's not really like publicly been talked about much because people didn't really clock onto it, but it doesn't actually work properly in React Native, or didn't work properly before the new architecture, because the rendering paradigms were very different. And so those React behaviors that you knew about and were used to didn't really translate properly into the React Native world. And it made it quite difficult to reconcile these. And for library maintainers, it made it very difficult for them to create libraries that behaved and rendered in the same way across web and mobile. And with Fabric, which is a part of the new architecture, they've consolidated those rendering behaviors and made it synchronous and made it behave in a similar way. So that opens the door to creating libraries that are really truly cross-platform in a way. Obviously, the library maintainers will still need to create platform-specific code for each of these, but the behaviors are going to be a lot more consistent, which I think is a really important step. And so a lot of the right sort of building blocks for this are being done, and it's not just Fabric, but React Strict DOM and a lot of these other efforts that are being done by Meta's core React Native team and React team are really pushing sort of the direction for these to converge between each other from React and React Native.
So how has the approach for code sharing evolved from simple JavaScript sharing to more comprehensive universal React stacks?
At a bare fundamental level, if we go back 10 years when React Native was originally launched, you can share JavaScript code that isn't reliant on any of the React behaviors or the browser behaviors, utility functions, or maybe some objects that have some configuration and so on and so forth, maybe some API calls, stuff like that. And over time, I think this community evolved around people wanting to share more and more. And a lot of things like data or state management libraries have support between React and React Native, and that was there for many years. But more and more recently, there was this push of, could we get even UI to be shared, which is probably the hardest problem that there is, right? Because of how really the bare bones parts of these primitives are different across web and mobile. And so a lot of efforts went into place. There was like Native Base, which came out quite early on, and that was a first stab at it, and it was a very tough task to do, and it didn't work out quite well because of performance reasons, but somebody had to do it the first time, and somebody was bound to do it in a way that it was a very difficult task. But then more and more of these libraries came out. So you had libraries like Native Wind come out, which was, we've got Tailwind on the web, surely we can create the equivalent on native with style sheets and then have a way that the implementations differ. And more libraries came out. So there's not just UI libraries, but more like utility libraries that came out that allowed for stuff like this to happen. A really good example that I like to mention is this library called Zego. And Zego is a library that allows you to create context menus. Now, seemingly a very small part of like how you build an app, but actually I think it encompasses these principles really well, because on the web, Zego just creates a radix context menu. So it's something that web developers are very familiar with. But on the native layer, it defers the implementation to native iOS context menus and native Android context menus. And so even these small micro interactions, people are starting to think about and create universal solutions to. And so I think over time, what's ended up happening is that because of this ecosystem that's formed, and because of some of the efforts that Meta and larger players within this space have been putting in, you get the culmination of those results being something like Expo Router, which is a full stack sort of navigation library or meta framework that sits on top of Universal React and basically handles your routing for you, handles deep linking for you across different sort of platform handoff and so on and so forth. And so I think we've reached a point where we have almost all of the pieces in place to be able to create a full universal app without needing to go down to the bare levels and create some of these libraries that don't exist. And I think we're reaching that critical mass of maturity where it starts to become more and more mainstream. And it's very exciting that that's the state that we're in right now.
It is. And it's exciting too, for anybody who's not as familiar with Expo, they recently became the recommended way to build React Native apps. So if you're building something new, you're probably going to be reaching for Expo in the future.
100%. Yeah. Kudos to the Expo team. They've really, like, from day one, stuck with React Native through the ups and the downs and created the SDKs and the tooling and the CLI and all of the sort of continuous deployment tools that you need in order to be able to build React Native app. There's nothing else out there that quite works like Expo. So big shout out to the Expo team for that.
All right. So we've talked about how things are converging and, it's all kind of gelling together and becoming one. Could you walk us through some of the ways that tools like React Native for Web and libraries like Tamagui and GlueStack are contributing to building those universal apps?
Yeah, sure. So, React Native for Web, as mentioned, is like the base block, right? Like, it's just the compatibility layer. Like, how do I take the views and the texts and convert them to DOM elements? But libraries like GlueStack and Tamagui are building on top of that and really creating full-fledged UI libraries similar to like how would you use something like Material Design and all these other libraries. It's more sort of components that you can use and reusable components. A lot of really interesting, I'd say, innovation has come out of libraries like this. Tamagui is a really worthwhile one to mention because Tamagui tries to escape some of the limitations of React Native Web even and creates like a compiler layer that optimizes your web code. Because one of the sort of traditional complaints about React Native on web is that it's not really that performant from translating native views and text and so on and so forth to good web DOM elements that supports things like SSR and so on and so forth in a performant way that doesn't affect your SEO negatively. And so Tamagui's been experimenting, I'd say, at a very base level and maybe in some cases even production ready. But I think the experimentation is incredibly important because it starts off asking some of those questions like, how can we make React Native Web even more performant? And how can we create things like compilers that at build time optimizes our web code in a way where we're not penalized because we are using React Native on the web? And so I think something like Tamagui is incredibly powerful. You mentioned GlueStack as another example. I think GlueStack was probably the first example in the React Native ecosystem that took the ShadCN approach, which was people don't really want these UI libraries that are like fully batteries included and are restrictive in the API. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to create these copy pastable components that don't require you to be pinned to a specific UI library version and gives you flexibility to modify things if you do want to change them and tailor them to your specific needs as the consumer of the library. So I think libraries like these are so incredibly important to push the state of play forward in the universal scene.
Yeah. And I mean, anybody who's been in web development for any length of time will remember the Bootstrap era when every website looked like it was Twitter. It had Twitter blue buttons and it was designed by exactly the same thing.
Yep. 100%. I remember exactly that era and I'm so glad we're past that time.
Me too. There are so many good options out there too. Like you mentioned Antisign. That is one of my favorite component libraries still. It's just Everything out of the box looks nice. It works so well. It handles complex interactions with ease. It is still one of my favorite component libraries to reach for.
Yeah, Ant Design is great. It's been a while since I've used it, admittedly, but it was a great choice back then. I'm sure it's still a very good choice.
All right. So how would you recommend actually approaching layout and navigation customization for different form factors? Because I know that that's a big thing that a lot of people probably struggle with, is going from web to native or vice versa.
Yeah, that's a really important one. And I think that's one of those things that can help universal apps not feel like they're a mobile app that's just been ported over to the web or vice versa. I think the layout is one of the things that I like to talk about with universal apps is like a pyramid of what you share or what you don't share within UI. You start at the top of the pyramid, which is what you can share, which is your design tokens. So things like some of the colors, the padding, the spacing, and some of the iconography and fonts and so on and so forth. You go a level below and you get to components, and these components can be largely shared, at least in the API and how it's defined. But maybe you need to create some platform-specific interactions. As an example, you want to delegate to the native layer for context menus and maybe use something like Radix on the web. But when you get to layouts, which is like where you bring everything together, I think it's a big mistake to try to share these because inherently the form factors and the interactions are very different between web and mobile. I think part of what you want to do with this is, even in terms of your navigation structure, it's great that there are tools like Expo Router there where you can share the same navigation, but you've got to really think about how you want to tailor these, and maybe you have separate routes for web and mobile depending on how these platforms are set up. And the classic example that I like to give with this type of thing is if you go to Twitter on web and you try to look and see where is your main feed and where is your search, you'll notice that on the web platform, these are all on the same screen. So when you go to Twitter or x.com these days, and on the main feed is just in the center of the page. And then on the right-hand side, you've got another column, which is your search functionality. Go onto the mobile side, and these are isolated into two separate tabs. They're not even on the same screen. And so if you try to replicate everything one-to-one, what you'll end up finding is that you won't be able to optimize for these different form factors. So even before implementation, I think there's a moment that you need to take a step back and think about your feature boundaries and think, where are the different features within my application? And do they live on the same screen on web? Do we separate them out on mobile, and so on and so forth? I think a large portion of it is thinking about the UI and the UX. And then there's an element to it, which is, how do I technically achieve it? Which I think through platform-specific extensions within React Native, you can easily do that. But you just need to plan for it more from a UI UX problem. I've typically seen it's really like more of a UX thought consideration and an architecture issue or an architecture challenge rather than it being not having the APIs available for it.
Yeah. So even though it can be done, or it could go immediately from a web view into a UX or a native view, it really still bears consideration and strong decision making of, is that's the best way to deliver this feature.
100%. Yeah. And I think one of the things that, like a very specific tactical tip that I would give is, don't tie your individual features to specific routes or screens in whichever order you're designing. If you're designing web first or mobile first, think about the boundaries of those features. So if you've got a feed, isolate that and don't tie that to /app/feed or something like that. Make sure that's individually isolated, because then when you do need to think about the different interactions, you can easily put them into different routes without having to have those nasty refactors of moving the entire route and changing the data fetching structure and all of that, which ends up being a real pain. Just think about that ahead of time, and it really helps.
That's very solid advice. All right. So one thing that you mentioned during your talk was there were some challenges with maintaining parity between the React Native core and the out-of-tree platforms. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of those challenges are?
Talk with a bunch of different people in the React Native ecosystem, including folks from Meta and the community. And this was one of the big topics this year. Just as like a primer, out-of-tree platforms are the platforms that are not the main platforms of React Native that are maintained by Meta. So iOS and Android are part of React Native core, and then anything else, which is Windows, Mac OS, tvOS, and web, of course, and Vision OS now, actually. All of these are maintained by the community, so they're called out-of-tree platforms. And these out-of-tree platforms obviously need to keep up to date with Meta's main sort of branch of React Native. A lot of these are forks, basically, effectively. And you've got, as an example, Microsoft maintaining the Windows and the Mac OS forks of React Native. And if you go into the issues tab of, let's say, React Native Windows, you'll see that there's like something like 70 or 80 open issues about how certain APIs in React Native Core aren't the same to the ones in Windows. And React Native Windows and macOS are perhaps the best out-of-tree platforms out there. They're incredibly well maintained. The Microsoft team does a phenomenal job of maintaining them and keeping them up to date. But I think it's just such a difficult task to keep in parity because there's such a large API surface in React Native that out-of-tree platform maintainers will sometimes fall behind with some of these things. And I think where the core of this comes from, and I've looked into it and tried to do a little bit of research, but I think where the core of this issue comes from is that the API surface of React Native has just evolved organically. It hasn't necessarily always had to consider out-of-tree platforms. And so if you go into some of the docs for Pressable, as an example of a component, which is your basic interaction block, you'll see that there are these props within it, which are like Android_Ripple, or like text break strategy iOS, text break strategy Android. And there's these APIs that you can clearly see are very tied to iOS and Android implementations, but not necessarily these generic APIs that should be available to just target any platform there is, regardless of it being a mobile device or a desktop device or a web platform. And so I think that's really the core of it. And so I think the efforts that need to be taken into place is to consolidate some of these APIs, get rid of some of the ones that don't make sense. And that's happened once in the history of Native. There was the Lean Core effort several years back where they got rid of a bunch of APIs that didn't need to exist in core React Native, and that helps out-of-tree platform maintainers quite a bit. But I think there's still a lot to do to slim down the API surface to make it easier for out-of-tree platform maintainers to stay on top of these things.
That makes sense. So it sounds like it's time for another cleanup or a redoubled effort. That makes total sense. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Universal React and its performance across platforms. What optimizations can developers make to ensure a smooth experience on whatever platform it might be running on?
Is that you need to have a good footing in like performance optimizations on both native platforms and web. Native platforms are different in terms of how you optimize the performance compared to web. They have their different sort of priorities and strategies that you need to have. So if you start from the native side, obviously you need to know how to keep your CPU and RAM usage quite low and make sure that you don't overburden certain threads and so on and so forth. And your FPS is always at 60 frames per second. But because a lot of this code is running client side and you don't need to worry about indexing it or anything like that, other metrics don't really matter per se as much. You go onto the web and you're in a world where SEO is incredibly important. And then every bit of latency or every bit of data that you're shipping is important for how your app performs. And so you're left in this state where you're thinking about those metrics in the core web vitals like FCP, LCP, your layout shifts, and so on and so forth. And then on native as well, you're optimizing for CPU usage and RAM usage and your FPS is not having drops. And so ultimately, you have to be good and well versed in both of them. But what it boils down to is knowing in which places to make platform specific versions of components or changing what you're using on each platform. So the example that I like to give is like list components. On web, you probably don't want to just take flat list, which is the default list component, and just throw that into web because it comes with a whole bunch of JavaScript. For a problem that you don't really want to make that heavy on the web, you probably want to use something like TanStack list or TanStack. I don't remember the exact name of the library nowadays, but the list component that's virtualized on web, let's say. And so stuff like this, those individual components that you choose or the UI libraries that you choose and the styling solutions that you choose can make a real difference. Styling is another one where there are compiled CSS options and then there's CSS and JS or JS and CSS and JS options. And that makes a real difference on the web depending on what you're choosing. This is also something that I think the web ecosystem has come to terms with over the years. You want to use something like Native Wind as an example where you can compile those styles ahead of time so that you're not running an additional sort of JS run to consolidate those styles, calculate them, and then paint them. So stuff like that is important. But really, there's another layer as well with Universal React, which is that you have to consider, which is the bundler. So Metro is the default React Native bundler. Because Metro is built for mobile, they haven't really tackled things like tree shaking, which is incredibly important on the web because you want to make sure that you cut down your bundle size from the different libraries that you pull in. JavaScript bundle is huge because Hermes handles that for you at the JavaScript engine layer. On the web, though, you don't want to ship a whole bunch of JavaScript because that really impacts your performance negatively, not just that execution, but in terms of the latency and then what that means for your performance and your SEO. And there's a lot of different considerations. People oftentimes use like Next.js plus obviously Webpack or SWC for the web portion of it, and then use Expo for the mobile portion of it, and then import components into monorepo setup to tackle some of these issues and these challenges around performance. So there are these different considerations that you're going to have to make on the bundler level, on your library choices, and even on your component implementation layer. And so there's a lot of choices, and at every step, you're going to have to be thinking about multiple platform performance optimizations.
So if you were going to build something brand new from the ground up today, what would you choose, or what would your strategy be?
I think about this a lot, actually, because I think it's one of those things where it's it depends answer, as much as I hate those. For anything that's content heavy, you've got some pages where you may have, let's say, a blog, but a blog isn't maybe the best example because you don't need a mobile app for it. But let's say a video streaming application or something like that, where on the web, you still may want to index some of those pages so that people can go through it, or a news site or a news application. For those things where the content is important to be indexed and be high performance on the web, I would go for a mixture of using Next.js on the web and then on the native platforms using Expo. But if you're really just building a client-side application that doesn't need to be indexed, it's just like an admin portal or a dashboard or something like that, I would use just Expo and use Expo Router because it works great for that. Yes, you will have a little bit of a performance hit, but I think the returns on what you're getting in terms of how little complexity there is to have both web and native is really powerful. So I think those are the trade-offs that you have to think, like how important is SEO and web performance to you versus how much do you want to make sure that you're really sharing as much as possible, because splitting off the bundlers and splitting off your actual applications, but importing from the same components adds a layer of complexity to your repo setup and to your CI and CD processes. And I think that's the trade-off that you're going to have to make. Do you share more at the cost of less optimization, or do you share less? And share still a lot, I'd say, but share less and optimize a little bit less on the web platforms.
Yeah. Those are all good things to keep in mind when you're building any kind of application. It may be an internal app that needs no SEO, and maybe you're great doing everything on the client side if that's the case.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So before we wrap things up, we're going to head into the quick round. So Mo, what is Universal React in one sentence?
It's a way to scale the different platforms that you're on as an app without necessarily scaling complexity, and being able to meet your users wherever they are, regardless of the platform.
And how does Universal React empower small teams to compete with big tech?
I think one of the challenges that indie devs and smaller companies face is they have to ask the age-old question of, should it be a mobile app or should it be a website? And I think that Universal React is that sweet spot where you can have both. And so I think that by being on more platforms, smaller applications and smaller teams can start to compete with some of the more established players without necessarily having to have the overheads of having multiple teams and different products roll out and so on and so forth, which means that they can really just outpace some of the established players. And if they're building really good products, they can probably really establish a footing in the market. And I think that's really powerful for smaller companies and indie devs. And if you look at Blue Sky as an example, they're a very small team taking on Twitter. And so that is an incredibly powerful story, and they're doing it thanks to Universal React.
What is the biggest challenge in building truly universal apps?
I think the biggest challenge is that you need to really take a step back at various points of the development lifecycle, whether that's UI, UX design, implementation, and architecture planning for a big feature. Think about what you should share or what you shouldn't share. I think it's ultimately an architecture question more than anything. You fall at the risk of sharing too much and not thinking about platform-specific optimizations, and you end up with a web app that looks a lot like a mobile app, or a mobile app that doesn't truly feel native. The biggest challenge is knowing when to take a step back and plan so that you can optimize for each of these platforms specifically and deliver truly native experiences on each of the platforms.
Nice. And what is one piece of advice for developers transitioning from React to Universal React?
I think the biggest piece of advice that I would have is to really understand the native platform-specific UI and UX on each of these platforms really well. So if you're a web developer, start playing around with some of the best native apps that you can find and really see those micro interactions and see the animations and how they behave on mobile. These are things that you probably interact with on a day-to-day basis, but you don't necessarily think about too deeply. And as a mobile developer, you've got to think about and learn about some of the web side of things. But for web developers, really go in and start to think about the micro interactions. And so when you step into the universal React world, resist the urge to use sort of JS only, web only implementations or things that are not using and leveraging the native layer to the full level, and think about where you can use the native platforms to their full power. And I think mastering that will help you craft really best in class universal apps.
Well, Mo, it has been great to talk to you today. Is there anything about Universal React that we haven't covered yet that you want listeners to know?
The one thing I would mention, give it a shot. If you haven't been in the React Native ecosystem for a long time, if you've used React Native back in 2017, 18, and you're like, this is not for me, this is too much headache, give it a shot and try it out. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised, especially with tools like Expo, how you can build these great native functionalities and native apps that really act and behave like any native app that you use on a day-to-day basis, but comes with all of the React niceties and all of the React features that you get to know and love on the web. And I think you'll find that it's in a really sweet spot. And the moment that you take it universal as well, I think you'll find another level of magic to it. And for people who haven't tried it in a long time, they come to it. I usually find that they get so pleasantly surprised and that they become believers after a few hours of playing around for it. So if you haven't been in the React Native and in the universal ecosystem, give Expo Router and give Expo a shot. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.
So is that where you would recommend people go first to learn more about Universal React?
Yeah, absolutely. I think start with Expo Router. They've got all of the SDKs and the tooling for you. And once you get to grips with that, then you can naturally move on to thinking about optimizations with Next.js if you do want to have a content-heavy site or so on and so forth. So yeah, definitely start with Expo first.
Excellent. And if people want to get in touch with you to talk more about this or anything else, where are the best places to find you?
I'm on Twitter/X, so it's Mo_JAVAD. You can also find me on Blue Sky at Mo Javad, so JAVAD at bluesky.social. So yeah, both Blue Sky and Twitter are great.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much once again for joining us on the PodRocket podcast. It's been great having you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.